That's not a modern historian describing what happened to ancient Egyptian religion. It's a Hermetic text describing what was going to happen centuries before it did. This is the Asclepius, written in Roman Egypt around 1800 years ago. Actually ancient, unlike the Kybalion. And it is the strangest text in the entire tradition, part practical manual for putting gods inside statues, part prophecy of its own religion's death. Almost everyone who quotes it stops exactly where it gets interesting. We're not going to stop there. To understand why this text matters, you have to understand what it actually is, and how strange its survival has been. The Asclepius is a dialogue, Hermes instructing his student Asclepius, the same format as several other Hermetic texts. But here's the problem. Unlike Poimandres and the rest of the Corpus Hermeticum, which survive in the original Greek, the Asclepius survives almost entirely in Latin. The Greek original is lost. What we have is a translation of something we can no longer check it against. That alone should give you pause, and we'll come back to it. But first, the content, because it is genuinely unlike anything else in the tradition. Roughly a third of the way through, the Asclepius describes something startling: how to put a god inside a statue. Not metaphorically. The text gives Hermes explaining to Asclepius that certain earthly materials, specific herbs, stones, and substances, could be combined in careful ritual to draw a divine or spiritual presence down into a crafted image, so that the statue could then speak, prophesy, heal, or work wonders. Scholars who study this material seriously, not dismissively, but as a genuine window into ancient religious practice, treat the animation of statues as a real and widespread current in the ancient world, one this text describes with unusual technical precision. Sit with that for a second. A god placed inside stone by instruction. Because the text doesn't stay there. It turns, and it turns hard. Hermes turns to prophecy. He tells Asclepius that a time is coming when Egypt, the land the text calls the temple of the whole world, will be abandoned by its own gods. The dead will outnumber the living. Egypt's religion will survive only as an empty tale, which its own descendants will no longer believe. Only the stones, Hermes says, will remain to tell of what once was. This passage has a name, the Lament, and read against what we actually know happened, the slow Christianization of Roman Egypt, the destruction of temples, the end of the old religious order, it reads less like a general warning and more like something written with startling specificity. Which raises the obvious question: was this genuine foresight or something else? Here's where it gets complicated, and there are two separate problems worth taking seriously. The first is the manuscript problem we set aside a moment ago. We don't have the Asclepius in its original language. Every claim we make about what it really says runs through at least one layer of translation, made by someone whose fidelity to the lost Greek we can't fully verify. This is a real, live problem in Hermetic scholarship, not a minor footnote. When a text survives only in translation, subtle shifts in meaning, emphasis, even outright alterations can enter without leaving a trace we can check against the original. But sit with the specific shape of that problem for a moment, because it's stranger than a generic warning about translation. There's an old saying that history is written by the victors. The Asclepius is a peculiar case of exactly that. Here is a text prophesying the death of Egyptian religion, and the only reason we can read it at all is that it was preserved, copied, and carried forward in Latin by the very civilization whose rise coincided with that death. The Greek original disappeared in the world that was ending. The Latin translation survived in the world that replaced it, which means the losing side's own testimony reaches us only because the winning side chose to keep a copy of it.
in a language of their choosing for reasons of their own. Not necessarily out of malice. Texts get copied for all kinds of motives, including genuine intellectual interest. But every act of translation is also an act of selection. Words get chosen. Emphases shift. What sounded like one thing in Greek arrives sounding like something slightly different in Latin, filtered through the assumptions of the person doing the filtering. So when we read the Lament and find it eerily accurate about the fall of Egyptian religion, we should at least notice the shape of the room we're standing in. We are reading a prophecy about a civilization's end in a copy made by the successors of the people who ended it.
The second problem is different in kind, and it goes directly at the prophecy itself. The Lament describes, in remarkably precise language, things that align closely with the actual decline of Egyptian religion under Christianization, including events like the destruction of the great temple complex at Alexandria in 391 CE. Scholars studying the composition of the Asclepius have to weigh a real possibility that the Lament, or at least its most specific and accurate-sounding details, may have been written or edited with the benefit of hindsight. A text doesn't have to be an outright forgery to have been shaped, consciously or not, by an author writing during or after the events being foretold. And that distinction matters enormously. If the Lament was written before the fall, it is prophecy. Someone saw what was coming. If it was written during or after the fall, it is testimony. Someone was describing what they were already watching happen in the language of prophecy. Both are interesting. Only one of them is foresight. And on the balance of textual evidence, working out which one we're dealing with is genuinely difficult, because the ambiguity is baked into the layers of loss and translation we already established. Two real problems, then. We can't fully verify what the text originally said, and even taking the received text at face value, we can't cleanly separate genuine foresight from retrospective dressing. That's not a reason to dismiss the Asclepius. It's a reason to be honest about what we can and can't claim on its behalf. Almost every popular retelling of the Lament quotes the destruction and stops. They leave out what the text says happens next, and that omission changes the whole meaning of the prophecy. Let's take the two threads of this text in turn, starting with the statues. The instructions the Asclepius gives are strikingly specific for something many readers assume must be purely symbolic. Particular herbs, particular stones, a careful ritual process performed with precision to draw a spirit into an object so it could actually speak and act. This wasn't unique to the Asclepius. The wider ancient world had a rich tradition of automata, moving and speaking statues, and scholars studying this material take seriously the question of what, exactly, people in antiquity believed was happening when they performed rites like this. Not as primitive confusion to be explained away, but as a coherent religious practice worth understanding on its own terms. And here's the real question this raises, one this channel isn't going to resolve for you because it doesn't have a clean answer. If this was only ever meant as metaphor, a poetic way of describing reverence or the presence of the divine in matter generally, why record it with this much technical precision? Metaphors don't usually come with an ingredient list. There's a real tension between reading this material symbolically, the way modern audiences are inclined to, and reading it as the text seems to present itself, as functional instruction. Ancient religious practice is often flattened by modern readers into either the ancients were being poetic or the ancients were credulous, and this text resists both. We're not going to tell you which one is correct. What's worth sitting with is simpler than that. The specificity is the interesting fact. It proves nothing worked, but it makes the easy explanation harder to hold. And there's a further problem, one that survives even if you take the text completely at its word. Consider what these rites assumed: a practitioner trained from childhood inside a living religious culture.
a specific relationship to the gods being invoked, absorbed long before any ritual began. A shared understanding of what a statue even was, not a decoration, not an artwork, but something closer to a vessel. And an entire framework of meaning that no one wrote down because no one needed to. Everyone already knew it. All of that is gone, not mistranslated, not corrupted, gone. The religion that gave these words their weight no longer exists, and the last people who lived inside it died more than 1,000 years ago. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Some knowledge may not be recoverable through instruction at all. Not because it was hidden or encrypted or lost in translation, but because it never lived in the instructions in the first place. It lived in the people, and they are not here to ask.
Now the lament. And this is where the pattern interrupt matters, because most retellings, the ones that circulate as quote images, the ones that show up in documentaries about ancient prophecies, stop at exactly the darkest line. Egypt abandoned, its religion an empty tale, only stones remaining. But the text keeps going. After the darkest section, Hermes tells Asclepius that this destruction is not the end of the story. The world, having fallen into disorder, will be renewed. A new order returns. This is not a minor coda. It's the structural resolution the whole prophecy has been building toward. Scholars examining this material have noted that this pattern, collapse followed by renewal, maps onto a recurring idea across the ancient world. A cyclical, rather than linear view of history, showing up independently in Stoic philosophy's account of cosmic destruction and rebirth, and echoed in the language of decline and restoration found across several ancient religious traditions. And if that shape sounds familiar, it should. 18 centuries later, a Chicago lawyer would call it the principle of rhythm. Everything flows out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall, and presented as ancient Hermetic wisdom. On this one, at least, he wasn't wrong about where it came from. Why does the doom get quoted so much more than the hope? Probably because doom travels better. It's more visually striking, more shareable, more dramatically satisfying as a standalone image. But quoting only the collapse and leaving out the renewal doesn't just make for an incomplete summary. It changes what kind of text this actually is. Read in full, the Lament isn't a document of despair. It's a document about how decline and renewal relate to each other, and about what it might mean to sit inside a period of loss without assuming it's the final word. That's worth something practically, independent of whether you think the prophecy itself was foresight or retrospective dressing. Because the actual usable idea here isn't the ancient Egyptians could see the future. It's a specific transferable posture. When you're inside a story about decline, a civilization's, an institution's, your own, the Asclepius's full text argues against reading only the collapse and stopping there. The collapse is real enough, but a narrative that ends at collapse and a narrative that continues past it into renewal are, structurally, completely different stories. And choosing which one you're telling yourself matters. And it matters in a specific mechanical way. Not because believing in renewal makes it arrive, it doesn't. But because where you place the ending of the story determines what you can see from inside it. Consider what happens when you decide a chapter of your life has ended in failure. The job that fell apart, the relationship that didn't hold, the version of yourself you can't get back to. If the story stops there, if collapse is the final word, then everything that follows is just aftermath, damage to be managed. You are, in your own account of yourself, someone that something happened to. But if collapse is the middle of the story rather than the end of it, then the same wreckage becomes something else entirely. Not less painful, not less real, but it becomes material, the ground the next thing gets built on rather than the last page. This isn't optimism. It's not telling you the renewal is guaranteed, because it isn't, and anyone who promises you otherwise is selling something.
The Asclepius doesn't promise it either. It simply refuses to stop at the ruin. That's a much more modest claim, and a much more useful one. Because here's what actually changes. If you're standing at the end of a story, you look for someone to blame, or you look away. If you're standing in the middle of one, you look for what comes next. And the ruins look completely different depending on which of those two people you are when you're standing in them. If this kind of full-text honesty is what you came here for, subscribing is the way to follow it. Every episode takes one claim from this tradition and examines all of it, not just the part that quotes well. So where does the Asclepius actually leave us?
On the statues, unresolved, and it should stay that way. The instructions are too precise to wave away as pure poetry, but even taking them at face value, we may be holding a recipe for something we can no longer cook. The words survived, and the world that gave them meaning did not. On the Lament, we cannot say whether Hermes saw the future. What we can say is that the text does not end where people stop reading it. Its own shape, ruin and then return, offers something more durable than a verdict on the prophecy. It offers a way to stand inside a story of decline without collapsing into either denial or despair. And that survives regardless of who wrote it or when. Two threads, neither one closes cleanly. The theurgy leaves us holding instructions we may no longer be able to follow. The Lament offers a structure worth carrying, whether or not you believe a word of the prophecy that contains it. Most retellings of this text take the half that quotes well and leave the rest on the floor. The text itself refuses to do that, and neither will this channel. If this is the kind of inquiry you've been looking for, rigorous, honest, and genuinely open, subscribe and follow along. Every episode takes one question from the Hermetic tradition and examines it from every direction available to us.